and thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you for the cool weather. I feel very acclimatized coming from Canada. I walk around with no jacket on, so just forgive me for that. And I know from my experience last year when it got a little cool, people like to, so welcome to all of you who are online this evening. So I'm going to spend the next 30 to 35 minutes to take us through the COVID pandemic and the rearview mirror, successes, failures, and unintended consequences. You have that actually in your brochures, but I'm going to focus on the need to embrace evidence-based medicine to inform policy decisions on non-pharmacologic interventions. Just by way of disclosures, I have a number of working committees that I've been on, grants and clinical trials. There was one that had pharmaceutical funding, which I'll declare was for a Staph aureus quadrivalent vaccine trial in spinal surgery, funded by Pfizer, but I received no personal remuneration. It was all given to the University of Calgary to hire a research nurse. And territorial acknowledgement that this was not here, but where the talk was put together was in Calgary, in the heart of southern Alberta, and acknowledged the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika-Pikuni, Kenai First Nation, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda. And also it's home to Métis Nation of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. Learning objectives are successes and failures, unintended consequences during the pandemic, some background on evidence-based medicine and the need to embrace it in looking at the non-pharmacologic interventions, which probably caused the greatest societal disruption in looking at it, and then why we need randomized controlled trials and high-quality evidence of other types, and also to touch on what I learned from a year of EBM at Oxford, and overcoming challenges in conducting controlled trials during a pandemic. So for successes, and some of you will be aware of this, so I won't spend a lot of time on some of this, rapid identification and sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that was done with great rapidity, and then the development of point of care and laboratory diagnostics for PCR. And then we saw just a flurry of randomized controlled trials for the pharmacologic, the drug-related interventions. So here we have antivirals and monoclonal antibodies, plasma, vaccines, steroids. We saw the WHO Research Forum in February of 2020 to look at large adaptive platform trials. Some of you remember these terms, recovery, remap, CAP, solidarity. They were considered huge successes. It brought us dexamethasone in treating the problems with the lung consolidation during those with COVID-19 pneumonitis. And by April of 2020, there were over 500 clinical trials, huge numbers of randomized controlled trials for vaccines, almost 400,000 participants, and by March of 2022, 11 billion doses administered. So that's a great success in terms of the pandemic overall. Successes and failures, I've commented on both of them here. The lack of high-quality evidence for NPIs, although we had high-quality randomized trials for the vaccines and the drugs. There was a scoping review 18 months into the pandemic, and all the references are at the bottom of PIs versus NPIs. And they looked at a number of databases. They found 4,000 registered trials worldwide. Only 41 or 1% were on the non-pharmacologic. So the closures, the lockdowns, all of these things that were being done. Only 9 were published, and many of them are still either ongoing or not yet started, or they were never published or withdrawn. And of the published studies that were of high-quality randomized trials, they were on PPE, testing and screening, and then music events and concerts, if you got tested before you went in. So that's where the focus was. And that compared to huge numbers in chloroquine, which turned out to be a failure in the trial. And some of the areas I've just highlighted here in the non-pharmacologic interventions, hand hygiene, surface cleaning, indoor ventilation, masks and face coverings, test, trace and isolate, physical distancing, school closures, workplace closures, shielding, border controls, travel restrictions. Most of you will be aware of this. And the ones highlighted in red where there was at least one trial, but most of them, there were very few trials in that number of 9. And actually, if we fast forward, and I'll show you a slide later, it hasn't gotten much better. Here's a group of investigators who looked at 5 non-pharmacologic interventions, NPIs I'll call them, and 3 PIs, and you can see that at the bottom there, you can see ivermectin, the antiparasitic drug, hydroxychloroquine in convalescent plasma. You can see completed RCTs, there's probably close to 100. And when you look at the other, you see 2. Yet they mandated CO2 monitors in schools in some places, mask mandates globally, sports and gym closures, mandated school upgrades, and business closures, mandated yet not a single randomized controlled trial. So it just shows the relative dearth of actually high-quality studies in this area. And one thing in Canada I'll comment, this is Sharon Strauss and her colleagues, who's a geriatrician and had been studying the elderly for many, many years. And Canada had some of the highest proportions of deaths amongst COVID-19 deaths globally. And it was a long time in the making because of the way the Canadian long-term cares system was set up. And this was published in BMJ just recently, actually. So it's something I would say we're not very proud of from a Canadian perspective. Some of the failures, a recent systematic review I found in 2024, well, actually 3 of them, and it comprises 372 studies. Interesting to look at it, not a single new randomized controlled trial on NPIs. So nothing really has moved forward. 2/3 of them were observational in the first BMC report, the Frontiers report. All but 2 of them, so 95%, were modeling studies. And they found no harms in any lockdown or distancing studies, which is a little hard to believe, but that's what their findings were. And then similarly, you had another public health review that was done of 151 studies. 100, this is a British publication, 100 were modeling studies. And yet there were 1.5 billion children globally affected by school closures. And a recent systematic review out of McMaster suggests that they were not necessary for transmission prevention. And that's really shaken up some people that thought school closures were the best thing to be able to do. So perhaps time to revisit that, and I'll show some other data about some of the impacts on the mental status of individuals who weren't able to go to school. And interestingly, Strauss and her colleagues have actually looked at 63 and just published a paper. I fished it out before coming here, 63 feasible NPIs to help socially frail elderly in a nursing home, yet none of them were really taken up to be looked at. And one of my favorite slides, somebody in the audience here, lack of good research during the pandemic is a pandemic tragedy. Sounds like something out of Shakespeare. I can say that here in the UK. But I actually happen to agree with this comment because I thought it was actually right on the mark. The hundreds of randomized trials for pharmaceutical and drug interventions, and very, very few that actually looked at the non-pharmacologic. And some of the unintended consequences. Think of the goals of a non-pharmacological intervention in terms of the closures, the lockdowns. Should be minimum impact, maximum impact, and minimal disruption. We had COVID-0 with some places going to complete lockdown. I think Melbourne, Australia, New Zealand, China, some places had very strict curfews associated with this and brought down by state or local governments. And despite the benefits, which were great, there were unintended consequences. And one of the things that's coming out in the literature now is the exposure to disproportionate impacts and inequities, which is one of the things that we've decided to look at, and how vulnerable groups were affected disproportionately. Some have said there may be a generational impact on children and teens because during that lockdown period, they didn't have that socialization portion of their lives. I have a psychiatrist friend of mine is in child psychiatry. He thinks there's going to be a generational effect where 1 in 5 will have a personality disorder or an adjustment disorder as they move into adulthood. I hope it's not true. One study from the World Journal of Pediatrics has suggested in a scoring globally that of the children that were affected, you can see in the graph at the very bottom here, I'll just show you the spike in depressive disorders and also anxiety in children. This is a global survey, and up to 60% scored above risk thresholds. And I found that study that just came out really a difficult one, and I hope that's not true. And of course, females and those that were from minority groups and or vulnerable populations were most affected. And this is an area that I think needs a lot more study. There's been a recent BMJ publication just last month, actually, that focused on a number of the unintended consequences and gave a really nice listing of them. And then, of course, Global Collateral is documenting a number of these as well. Other unintended consequences, and this is, again, from another review that just came out last year, the socioeconomic harms, travel, hospitality, business closures, unemployment, exacerbated income inequities, school closures, the digital divide, the online divide. So you'll do online learning, and that's how we'll get over it. But some new immigrant populations, those that are vulnerable or low income, they couldn't buy computers. They couldn't have their children online because they had no teaching during the school closures. And then there are issues about delayed access to health care, cardiovascular, cancer, elective surgery delays, mental health issues I've talked about. And then in Canada, at least, we're seeing very high rates of syphilis, STI. We just had a presentation on that. And I noticed in the UK and the States, very similar types of things have been noted. And then groups are studying the drug overdose and opiate overdoses, whether that's related, associated, or was on the rise anyway. All of them have to be looked at. Some other unintended consequences. We lived in the age of instantaneous social messaging. Social media was alive, and there was a parallel infodemic, as the WHO has called it. And we saw this overdrive, often very polarized views, either far to the left or far to the right. The centrist views seemed to get washed out. And it was, be it vaccinations, no interventions, no lockdowns, routes of transmission also, and quite strident opinions. Those that signed on to COVID zero, complete lockdown, 6 months, come out of it, there'll be no more COVID. And then those that said no measures. So somehow we've got to revisit this and find out where we can be in the centrist area. And it was across the political spectrum. We often found academics and politicians as well. In Canada here, just to show you very quickly, the famous immortal line that was on our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is very left-leaning in Canada. You don't copy the losers, and this is an academic physician. If you don't move on to our COVID zero strategy, you're a loser. And thought that's a little bit over the top, in my opinion. And then, of course, the right-wing paper, COVID zero is not going to happen in Canada, but there are advocates in our CBC saying, let's get the emergencies or the War Measures Act equivalent and bring in a police state to be able to mandate what we need to stop it. So all sorts of differing opinions, which is interesting. And here's some unintended consequences, pictures from China with COVID restrictions when they were very tight in Hong Kong. Also, you can see here in Australia, France, Italy, and then you can see the Melbourne lockdown with some very violent protests that occurred in Australia. And of course, the famous Canadian truckers convoy, which was ended when they invoked the Emergency Measures Act, which used to be the War Measures Act as a threat against security. It's gone to court, and I think most of us believe it'll end up in the Supreme Court someday to see what's going to happen. So what about evidence-based medicine? There's some controversy in the pandemic. You don't need randomized trials. They probably are not ethical. Some people stated unethical to do it in a pandemic. And there were some that actually voiced opinions in the academic literature. In a pandemic, policy overrides evidence. You simply act, set the agenda, and evidence will follow. And it's almost history repeating itself. When I look back at the RCTs from the 50s, people thought they were unethical. You need just expert opinion. So it's interesting how history repeats itself. Some of these slides I showed last year, so I may go through quickly. The first RCT was an amazing achievement. Bradford Hill and colleagues in 48, bed rest versus bed rest plus streptomycin. Astounding results in that you had this marked reduction in mortality. And then the polio vaccine, which also struck a lot of controversy at the time. And then later the thalidomide tragedy, and then suddenly we need RCTs because we had so many problems, that epidemic of stillbirths and phocomelia, if you remember, back in the 1960s. The regulatory agencies led by FDA said, no, we need randomized controlled trials so that we can avoid this in the future. And then there was reports that from 84 onwards, New England Journal papers suggest little evidence that you see treatment effect differences. In observational studies, you get large databases, it's going to be the same. But then we saw a series of failures. The hormone replacement therapy, if you remember about that, the MI strokes and venous thromboembolism that occurred in the not occurring in the observational studies, but suddenly in a randomized trial, you were seeing it. The beta-carotene story in lung cancer, vitamin E and its protective effect in cardiovascular disease. And a recent study I just pulled out, Cancer Registry observational data, there was a difference of 55% of therapeutic efficacy with randomized controlled data compared to observational data. So very important, again, to emphasize on this. And we know that observational studies are great for pathogenesis, prognosis, and diagnosis, but you always get these confounders and biases that are going to occur, and it's difficult to tease them out compared to an RCT, which actually gives you a equal starting point and usually have checks and balances on known and unknown biases, both for explanatory trials and also pragmatic trials, which is where most of the route is going now at this point. And some have argued a pandemic, you have a lot of the non-pharmaceutical or non-pharmacologic interventions. Trials are only designated for therapeutic drug interventions, but in fact, they've been used for cognition building in the elderly, devices, think of pacemakers, environmental interventions. They can be used for anything, not just for drugs. And they still consider the gold standard. And there's a number of observational study failures based on mechanistic studies, chloroquine, and of course we know that actually the recent studies have shown there was a harm injury from increased arrhythmias with the use of chloroquine. And some predicting there are many excess deaths as a result of overexuberant use of chloroquine. Prone positioning was a great NPI that was done in intensive care. The observational studies suggested there was a decreased risk of intubation and mortality, but ultimately the RCT showed there was a reduction in the risk of intubation, but no difference in mortality. So what about evidence-based medicine? What it is, what it isn't. And this is an article by David Sackett in the British Medical Journal. It was McMaster and came here and actually was involved in the original formation of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. I'll just quote, any external guideline must be integrated with individual clinical expertise. Clinicians who fear top-down cookbooks will find the advocates of evidence-based medicine joining them at the barricades. So joining the barricades, I came here to Oxford, and there I was and spent a year learning in Oxford about the necessity for doing or reinforcing my belief in the randomized controlled process. And here's the founder here, David Sackett, 1995. Originally born in Chicago, but became a Canadian citizen in the 1970s and did a great deal. I happened to sit across from Jeffrey Thomas, the first president of Kellogg College, who regaled me with the stories of how he helped recruit David Sackett to the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. And here's the building with the statue of Triton that Dr. Aronson and I spoke of on a couple of occasions. And on the left is the primary care building in humanities. And I enjoy this because I work in infectious diseases. So the first antibiotic, penicillin, was used to treat an infection in the old outpatient building, which I think is gone now, from the old Radcliffe Infirmary, February 12th, 1941. I have to give you the date because this is a landmark thing for me. I enjoy seeing it every time I come here. I have to go by to see the plaque. And here's Kellogg College, a collage of photos from my time spent here, which the cherry blossoms in spring was one of my favorites, and then the long row of Bletchley pictures there. And then I would spend time in the various libraries to try to inspire me to think better about some of the things I wanted to do. And then when that didn't work well, there's the lamb and flag and the so-called nickname of the bird and babe. I guess I shouldn't say that. Formerly the eagle and child, which had a tough time during the pandemic. So if all else fails, I tried to sit in the seat where C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien and see if that would help to inspire me. Challenges to RCTs, logistical, sample size, consenting at the individual level. I was involved with Dr. Mark Loeb, who's here tonight, with a N95 versus medical mass. We had to do remote consenting for the mass study because that's the order of the day. There are varying levels of recruitment, protocol adjustments because of mandates that were occurring, securing additional funding. There were challenges, but nonetheless, they all could be overcome. Politicization was another one that was a problem. And one of them was the fundamental opposition by some scientists and academics. You do not do randomized trials in a pandemic. They're too complex. And even the Royal Society report, which I was very disappointed in August of 23, policy approaches to SARS-CoV-2 made trials of individual NPIs almost impossible. And that's the kind of attitude that you have by some societies, which I thought is very unfortunate because any challenge can be overcome in my personal view. Confirmation bias, actually brought forward by Sir Francis Bacon in Novum Organum in 1620, where he actually, the inseparable belief, often highly emotional, that you interpret and favor anything you hear in a way that confirms your prior beliefs. So if you believe you can't do a trial in a pandemic, then that's your belief, and it's called confirmation bias. And I think we saw it in spades in the pandemic. Intellectual bias, where you have an attachment to a specific point of view and you can't move from it, somewhat related to the intellectual bias. So in other words, policy overrides evidence. Don't even bother thinking about a randomized trial of a non-pharmaceutical intervention in the pandemic. And then also issues of timeliness, dynamic changes. It's very rapidly changing. And then you get the social media critics who are very vigorously opposed to a randomized trial of an NPI. No, you just do it. You don't need that. There's no equipoise. It's unethical. And this reminded me of a Canadian philosopher, Marshall McLuhan, in his work in the 60s. Some of you may not remember. The medium is the message. He actually coined the term the global village and also predicted the World Wide Web and the internet 3 decades before it was invented. And this book came out from Peter Singer and Emerson Brooking, in the yellow there behind me, Like War, the Weaponization of Social Media. And it's interesting because there's a quote in the beginning of the book. I'm just reading it now, and it's actually so apropos because what you see is, and this is from Alexander Nix, and I just have to get the wording correct. It sounds dreadful, but there are things that you don't necessarily need to have the truth about. You just need to get people to believe it. And that's what we saw as a driver and how the weaponization of social media was used, not only in the pandemic, but if you think about many other areas where if you can get your point across and get people to believe it, that's all that matters. Who cares about the truth? That's a very unfortunate situation. And then you see things like this, where Scientific American, this group of authors came up with an opinion commentary piece. Here's the pyramid that I juxtaposed with systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials at the top, expert opinion and mechanistic studies at the bottom. And they said unequivocally, putting a randomized trial above other types of research like lab studies and modeling, has interfered with COVID. And they have no basis in science. So this is from some academics that put this out. So it's interesting to be able to see this paper if you want to look it up. It was in Scientific American. And so the conceptualization of the pandemic evidence collaboration, and this is what we're meeting about now and what Georgia introduced me about. Gather leading academics from across the globe and look at expertise in EBM and participate in an independent, non-governmental, I'll emphasize that, collaboration. It's funded by the McCall-McBain Foundation. We talked about this a lot, and I'll just comment. We thought if we get government funding, and I learned this long ago, he who pays the piper, or she who pays the piper, calls the tune. So therefore, they're very interested in just funding the next generation of learners. This way we can stay free of any government that wants to paint the responses of what we're doing with the color of the brush of the government of the day, left-leaning, right-leaning. Better to stay centrist. And so, as you've heard, this is the successful seed funding from McCall McBain, the groups that were announced by Georgia, and it was at a time when I came here for my visiting fellowship, and a lot of the planning went on. And here's a photo of the inauguration in April of 2024. Our 4 founding evidence-informed fellows from the UK, Oxford, and Bond University, McMaster, and University of Calgary. They're in the audience here, so say hello to them after. And the purpose is to identify and implement strategies to generate high-quality evidence for NPIs during public health emergencies, and establish this collaboration of independent academic evidence-based medicine groups to try to address this knowledge gap and to overcome the challenges, not only the planning, but also the systematic reviews of studies that have been done, or how to plan a better study in a future pandemic. And the focus is on NPIs, as was discussed earlier, and to build individual scientists' capacity is one of our principles, to have equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also a demonstrable conviction and strength in high-quality research. So that's what we're all about, and build these academic societal partnerships to facilitate strong evidence-based decision-making. And to generate answers to the following questions, generating high-quality evidence, not solely limited to randomized trials, but anything that will give us high-quality evidence for NPIs in a pandemic or global health emergency, fostering effective and efficient knowledge exchange, and then looking at the short and long-term consequences. And importantly, and we had a lot of debate when we launched in April, to include the inequities on health, economic, psychosocial, environmental, and the built environment for all of those, so that we didn't forget about the most vulnerable in looking at this. So we are purposely diving into that. And we've got pillars, diagnostic transmission, interventions, evidence, practice, and policy, with cross-cutting themes of definitions, nomenclature, data challenges, and methodologic issues. And several of the evidence-informed fellows are here. So that was part of the initiative from McCall McBain to ensure that we've got the next generation of learners that are being promoted as we move forward. And these were competitive positions, and they were reviewed only independently by members from different academic organizations. And they have some money in the McCall McBain for exchange fellowships, exchange visits. So I think that's a wonderful thing to have done, and we're hoping that the McCall McBain Foundation will be very pleased with enabling these very strong young investigators to further their careers and make international networking connections. 2 conferences planned, and I'll just wind up. Looking at the pandemic in the rearview mirror, which I gave you a taste of in Banff in Canada in May of 2025. So if you love to ski, it's a great place. If you love mountain scenery, it's also great. And we've got the speakers. When we asked speakers to come, they said yes immediately and said, this is a great idea. We need to do this. We need to look at this. And then the EBM Live in 2026, which will be at Rhodes House in Oxford, that will follow in on it. And here's Banff, Canada, showing you the lights and the mountains. I forget if that's, I think that's Cascade Mountain on the left there. I should know this. I go there all the time. So for those of you who are interested, remember you've got this at your seats, and send it around to your colleagues, to others, because we would like to see people. There's excitement being generated about this. It's going to be one of the first conferences of its kind to be able to look at the successes, failures, and unintended consequences focused on non-pharmacologic interventions. Interestingly, Dr. Fredham and I presented at this symposium virtually in Geneva in 2023 in October, and WHO is now looking very seriously at large platform trials for many of these NPIs as well, and I think revisiting. So I think we're right in lockstep, or they with us, in looking at generating evidence during pandemics and epidemics using high-quality randomized trials. And to overcome the challenges, I call it the 3 E's: early, equitable, and energetically. We need to look at these NPIs as well as PIs and build oven-ready research protocols, which is part of the work that we're going to be doing, and looking at getting ethical approval well in advance, much like they did with the recovery trial and others. There are platforms that can be used, building the partnerships and cooperation, which we're doing, and to look at benefits and harms equally: physical health, mental health, social health, socioeconomic impacts, and looking at it from short to long range, because there are many impacts that will occur years from now, and we need to be thinking about them now, not, oh, that's so far in the future, we don't need to worry about it. And with that, I'll close and be happy to entertain any questions, either here or online. Thanks very much.